So you'll have to forgive me. I thought I just filmed this segment, but turns out I forgot to put the camera on, so our epoxy's already mixed. I'll tell you what I did. I brought our knife up to the kitchen, up in the house, and I washed it really well. Hot soap and water, get the tang nice and clean. I brought it down, and I very lightly oiled the blade in front of the plunge. You don't want to go above that. Put a piece of masking tape on there. That'll give us a nice handle, and then we don't have to worry about scratching the blade. And also, we don't have to worry about that now when we work the handle. I used to have that problem. I would wrap it in paper towel and then tape, but it would be loose and it would still rub. And so now I put the tape right on the blade, and then that prevents that problem from occurring. I use Aquaglass gunsmithing epoxy. It's a little more expensive, but it's highly recommended for two reasons. It works well and it lasts a long time. Some of your less expensive epoxies, they only last 5 or 6 years. You make a knife, you sell it, customer comes back in 5 years and they're unhappy because their knife is falling apart. I like to mix the epoxy. I like to measure it in these little plastic syringes. So it's 1 part hardener to 4 parts resin. So what I'll do for one knife is fill this halfway with hardener and 2 full ones. They're 1 milliliter syringes with hardener. I'll dispense them into this little ketchup cup and mix it with a popsicle stick. And then I know I have a nice precise ratio. They do come with measuring cups that are graduated, but the kits are only designed for 2 batches of epoxy, so the graduations are much higher and essentially useless for this small little bit of epoxy. You've got to mix it for a good 4 minutes at least. So I usually do 2 full songs on the radio. You don't want to skimp on that. There's not really any point. Just mix it the whole time. Don't get impatient. Just be patient. For our handle material, what I'll do is clean it off with acetone, and that's going to remove any oils that we got on there accidentally, and also any oils on the surface of the wood, which is important if you have a species like cocobolo or other exotics that are very oily. And then I'll take, let me get a clean one. Then I'll take a different one and put a little bit of clean water, just enough so it's moist. You don't want it soaking wet. And I'll wipe it off again to remove any residue from the acetone. Acetone does leave residue behind, and it also raises the grain on the wood. I don't think quite as much on stabilized wood, but on regular wood it does, and I hope it does on the stabilized wood. But that would be nice, and it just helps the glue adhere to the wood a little better, I think. So just give that a couple of minutes to dry, and then just keep mixing your epoxy. Okay, that's been about 4 or 5 minutes. So what I'm going to do first is put a light coat right on our handle material. It doesn't have to be thick. It's very, very light. Then I'll do the same to the tank. Don't put too much up front, because whatever oozes out, you're just going to have to clean. Now, when we glue the other side on, it's okay to use a whole bunch of epoxy. But on this first one, I like to try and keep it light. And the reason for that is to fill in all these holes. But if you fill them in when you've only got one side glued on, it's just going to run out, and then you've got to clean that mess up later. So I've got epoxy on both sides. So I left maybe a good 1/2 inch here. I'm just going to put it here and just kind of work it up, getting an idea of where I want my scales to sit, making sure the epoxy is coming up that far. I usually like to stop about maybe 1/8 of an inch to 3/16 in front of the plunge. I used to get pretty up close to it, and at this point it's good to see, hopefully our plunge cuts are even. If they're not, if they're slightly off, that's okay. Just look at which one's further back so you don't get one up close and then you flip it and you try and match them up, and the other one is all the way over the plunge. So put just one clamp on there, and then while it's still loose, you can arrange how you want that to be. Now what I'm looking for is that where this curve terminates on the edges, that those 2 points are more or less straight. If they're not straight, I do think it's nicer for the top one to be further forward. So it looks about right, but what I'll do is I'll flip it over and I'll sort of look down. That can be tricky. So you can get just any straight edge. You're going to grab a popsicle stick. You can hold it against there and see. There. But now my apple wood is also kind of wonky on there, so I'm going to even just kind of start that process over and sort of realign my wood. It's sort of okay as long as it fits on there, but also, if you have a pattern in mind, specific areas of the grain that you want to keep, then that becomes important. Sort of came too far back that way. This is why a nice long working time is really nice. If I had to do all this in 5 minutes, I'd probably go crazy. There, I think I'm going to be satisfied with that. So what I'm going to do is put the rest of my clamps on. I want to make sure that the underside you're actually clamping onto the tank and not just on the side of the wood. Now the two you put in front, it's going to squeeze that epoxy even more. So that's something just to be aware of. On the front here, it's going to squeeze that out. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean this epoxy out of here, and I'll do that, the part that squirted out, that is. Now I use Q-tips and cotton balls, but Q-tips, I must warn you, if you push too hard, I think it pushes the cotton out of the way, and this little plastic stick it's on, I think it's going to, well, I know that it can scratch your blade. So again, you don't want it sopping wet with the acetone, just a little bit. Obviously, I would have this facing me if I wasn't with you guys. Now, I used to take a needle in a tissue and dab it very lightly in the acetone and run it along, but since I've started using the cotton swabs instead of paper towel, you can push that in there and get it nice. And then you can clean it out really nicely. There, now that's all there is to it. I might take a little bit of oil, and I've had problems with acetone staining the wood, so I'll push this tape up just a very little bit, and I'll put more oil on my Q-tip, but I'll very, very lightly oil this area. It's okay if you don't get it right up on there. You don't really want to get oil on your acetone or on your epoxy. But there, and that's all there is to it. I'll come back in 4 or 5 hours and glue the other side on. Wait a while, put the pins in, and then give it a good day or so to fully cure. It's been a couple of hours, all day actually. So our epoxy is set pretty well. Take the clamps off, and the next thing we want to do is we want to drill through these holes in the tank through our scales. So I'm going to clamp it to another piece of wood. I don't like to do it directly on the bench. I like to put another piece down to give support to the back of the wood, so the drill bit doesn't tear out the wood here. We don't want that. So I put it here, and I just don't think that the bench gives enough support. I don't think it's flat enough. There's too many gaps. I just like to be safe than sorry. So clamp that on there. 1/8 of an inch drill bit. The newer and sharper your bit is, the less likely you are to tear out the back. It doesn't really matter if you go fast or slow, just that you want to use light pressure. If you push really hard, again, that's going to increase the chance that you're going to tear out the back. Now the hole in the tank is going to guide, because it's a precise fit, it's going to guide our bit straight, but we still want to look at our bubble here on our drill and get it as straight as we can. Now we're going to gently sand our tang here. I also did this before on the other side. I didn't show it, but I'll show it this time. It's the same way for the other side. We've got some oxidation here from the etch, and we've got a little bit of epoxy here on our flat tang. So we're just going to gently sand, and we're going to make sure that we don't go past around here because we don't want scratches on our ricasso here. A few times I did it with this on. That was a mistake. You're just going to increase your chance of not having a perfect flat and rounding over your tang. So I'm just going to do it gently by hand. Sort of going to use my body to stop this from moving around. This is why we have our tape on here as a handle. Okay, I've gotten that epoxy off. So now I'm just going to come up here very gently and carefully. It's very easy to slip and, be in the corner crying. So I'm just going to be very careful, lining up this line of the belt with the scales here, so I know where the scratches are going to form. That's pretty close. I'm going to dare and go a little further. I'm going to go very slowly. Whatever you call it. We've got our epoxy mixed up. I did something a little different. With this is I mixed in a little bit of the sawdust. I took this scale and I went to the back of the sander and I held the cup and I sanded and I just put a little bit of dust, and that way you can dye your epoxy to perfectly match whatever wood you're using. The Acroglass kit somewhere in here does come with black and brown dye, which is perfect if you're using ebony or something like that. The brown matches pretty close to Cocobolo, but they don't have apple color dye and they don't have satinwood color dye, new color dye. So you can use that trick, especially if you think you're going to have some gaps. I'm pretty confident we're not going to have any gaps. I just thought I'd do that to show you guys. One place I do tend to have a little bit more gaps is with the pins. Especially if I'm doing the Corbies and when I'm countersinking for the heads, sometimes I get a little tear out and it doesn't quite get sanded all the way out. And so that's a good time to have the dye for that. And it doesn't take long, and it's just a nice little safety measure. I've found that in very small gaps, if you don't use dye, it sort of takes on the color of the piece of the wood anyways, a little bit. I think it's mostly just for big gaps. So now we couldn't really go upstairs and wash this in the kitchen sink because we've got wood on it. So I'm just going to take a cotton ball with a very little bit of acetone. I'm going to clean it off. And then very, very lightly with water to clean off that acetone residue. and then just a regular dry one to just dry that. We don't want any rust on our nice blade. And of course, it's always good to just try and keep it as clean as possible, since this side was washed when we did the other side. I like to clean it with acetone anyways. I don't know what kind of oils or residues or whatever are on my belts that I was sanding this with, so just to be sure. So same procedure as before. Now on this side, we can go ahead and put lots of epoxy, fill in these holes. And that just holds the scales on just a little bit better, having the glue from one side of the scales to the other. I don't know how much of a difference it makes, but it can't hurt. And half a milliliter of hardener with the appropriate resin seems to be just about perfect for one knife of any size. Even if you had a bigger knife, I'm sure it would be enough. I've got plenty here. It's pretty much overkill to do both sides, but so I mean there's plenty of epoxy. And now I'm going to, without getting too much epoxy all over myself, use my hands to line up the scales, ignoring this little corner that I used to sand. And you'll feel your finger when it's flush. And then we know that they're perfectly lined up because they're identical in size. The tricky part is getting the clamp on, because it's always going to move the scales a little bit. So here it brought the scale back this way, so I just have to adjust and sort of wrestle with this clamp. You know, even though that I've got these perfectly lined up, I'm still going to check the front just to be sure. Stuff happens, you know how it goes. So there's two things I'm looking for. One is that the actual fronts of these handles are lined up, and you can also tell by where they intersect the tang. You can look there to see if that's even. Check on both sides, and looks good to me. Just triple check, even if you think you've got it. It's good to double check, triple check, quadruple check, because once that epoxy sets, there's no more checking. Check as you put the clamps on. Check after you get the clamps on. Well, they seem to be a little low. The thing I'm going to do actually is wipe off a little bit of this excess epoxy just to get a better view. Not a lot, just the bulk of it. It does appear to be a tad low. And when I say low, I'm talking, I don't know, less than, I don't know, 0.1 millimeters. It's really very minute. There's also such a thing as over-checking. You can drive yourself crazy. At some point, you just gotta glue it on there. This is driving me a little crazy. When they talk about the little things, this is one of them. Some people probably don't care, but it matters, I think. It's worth it to spend the extra time to do it right. That's why I'm a poor knife maker, though. It takes me too long to make knives. I can't crank them out. So, forgive me, I'm going to check one more time. And I think I'm satisfied. So, just like before, get your cotton ball. There. Now we're gonna do like we did before and lightly oil. Well, that's dirty. Gonna lightly oil where the acetone was. Peel that tape back just a little. That's just to make sure we get all of it.